Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're going to start off today's show by discussing Israelis warning the Americans that if the Biden administration, for example, does, as it's promised, return to the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, that possibly could lead to a crisis in relations. And that's something that the Israeli Channel 12 has reported through a senior Israeli official, which says that essentially if Biden does go back to the Obama plan, as the Israelis have called it, that we would have nothing to talk about with him. And that's an exact quote. Now, Biden, as I said as well, has promised to, in fact, go back to the JCPOA if, of course, the Iranians also were to, ensure that they are, again, in compliance with that deal. The Americans were the one, as we of course know, who walked away under the Donald Trump tenure away from the JCPOA. This was a hard-fought agreement, certainly, and it's not just an agreement between the Americans and the Iranians, but of course there are other parties involved, such as European countries, etc. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Peter Hahn, who is a professor of history at Ohio State University. He's with a specialization, in the history of U.S. foreign policy. He's joining us this morning from Columbus, Ohio. Joining us today from Genoa, Italy, is Dr. David Unger, who is an ex-foreign affairs editorial writer for the New York Times, is also an author, and currently is adjunct professor of U.S. foreign policy at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies in Europe. David and Peter, thank you both for your time and for joining us here in Scope. Peter, let me start with you. What do you make of the Israeli warning? I mean, certainly, yes, the Israelis have been against the JCPOA, i.e. the Iran nuclear deal, from day one. But what kind of an effect will that then have on the Biden administration's policymaking? Should it even have an effect?
I read the warnings more as a bluff than as a serious threat to U.S.-Israeli foundational friendship. I think below the bluffing, there is a tier of Israeli officials who recognize the abiding importance of the partnership between the U.S. and Israel, and that cooler heads will prevail and some kind of negotiated settlement will be reached eventually.
So, David, how does one appease the Israelis while also going back into the JCPOA?
Here, I agree with Professor Hahn that I wouldn't bluff, I'd call it diplomacy. The Israelis took a very hard line on this the first time it came up to Congress during the Obama administration. It's clear they don't like the agreement. They say they'd like a tougher agreement that covered more things, that was more permanent, but basically they don't like the agreement. These are known positions, and they're flexing their muscles in the hope that they will get some response in their direction from the Biden administration.
So then, Pete, what is the alternative then if, for example, it's not the JCPOA? I mean, is the hope then on the part of the Israelis and even, I would think, some American officials that the Iranians would bend to an even tougher deal? I mean, is that even at this point realistic to expect?
Yeah, I think the question of the nature of U.S.-Iran relations going forward is an open book. We know what the Obama administration was able to achieve in 2015. President Biden arguably could be working toward a restoration of the 2015 accord if indeed it is still salvageable. It might prove true that it has been so damaged by the diplomacy of the Trump administration that it's not salvageable. But Biden, I think, has to think beyond the instrument of 2015 toward the goal that he's trying to accomplish, which is a nuclear-reduced Iran, and an Iran that operates within guardrails and questions like the export of missile technology and its sponsorship of what we deem as terrorist activities in foreign countries. The JCPOA might be the instrument for accomplishing some of those goals, or a modified JCPOA might be that instrument, or maybe some other series of agreements between the U.S. and Iran or the international community in Iran and reach that kind of an outcome. Biden probably has a natural affinity for JCPOA since he was vice president when it was established. But if he shows some flexibility, he might be able to tease out some other routes to accomplishing the goals that he has defined.
David, is it fair to say then that the JCPOA should be the first step towards what the U.S. wants to get from Iran, in the sense that, as Peter there said, from a U.S. perspective, keep Iran in line?
I think it should be the first step. It exists. We've been there before. If we could get both sides back to where they were, that would be a good starting point for the sort of things Peter is suggesting to go, which I agree with. We need a longer term vision of where we want this relationship to go. But we have the perception of the Obama administration, and I presume the Biden administration, because we're dealing with many of the same people, is that there was an immediate crisis of the progress of a nuclear weapons program. And the immediate priority was to get that frozen and locked in by an agreement. And to get an agreement, to do it voluntarily, to do it peacefully, you have to address the interests of both sides. I'm not saying it was the perfect agreement, but I am saying it was the perfect agreement that was attainable at that time. And I don't think a better one is attainable right now. I think the US leverage is actually less for getting a tougher agreement now because of what the Trump administration did. I think if we could go back to the status quo, that would be substantial progress that could be built on.
Exactly, Peter. You know, we're talking about leverage, right? I mean, I was in Iran as a journalist when the deal was signed. And at the time, there was a lot of excitement. There was a lot of positive energy about where that country's economy was then to head. And of course, in the ensuing years, ever since Donald Trump walked away from the deal, it's been harrowing for most Iranians as to what has happened to them, as well as their bank accounts. Just on that point itself, you know, that loss of trust, which was very hard fought. It's not easy to get that back, is it?
No, it's not easy. And Iran, of course, is divided between what the West defines as moderates and extremists. The legacy of the Trump era has given a boon to the extremists. And the moderates, those who are willing to take a chance on some kind of cooperative understanding with the Western world, are backed into a corner. So indeed, that is a difficult domestic political factor within Iran that complicates the whole puzzle.
And, you know, David, ever since the Trump walked away from the deal, we've also had then the assassination of Soleimani as well, which is huge, again, reality, especially for the Iranians, and something that I would think that they would keep in mind going forward. I mean, you've already alluded to this in your answer earlier about how the JCPOA, just getting that in and of itself would be a huge win. But do you think the next steps after that would be that much harder then?
I think they'd be hard, but I think that there has to be an effort. You know, when we say this was the diplomatic track, we're not saying it took place in some ivory tower insulated from other events, other pressures. Obviously, the sanctions played a role in convincing Iran it would be in its interest to solve this agreement. Let's look at the history here. When Obama came to office, they were mainly unilateral sanctions. What Obama did by a very complex diplomatic process was get the vise of effective multilateral sanctions to create enough pressure to affect Iran's calculation of its own self-interest to a very delicate point. Got it to the point where they were willing to undertake understandings, time-limited understandings on the nuclear weapons program only, not on actions in the region, not on terrorism, not on missiles, not on anything else. They took it as far as it would go. That depended on having Europe in line with the United States. That in turn depended on Europe trusting the United States strategy. Europe was not going to go along with the prior US-Israeli strategy of confrontation. Obama and Biden, the first time around, brought Europe in. Europe's pressure helped bring Iran to the terms of this agreement. I think if we can reconstruct all those forces, we can start to move forward again. That although Trump walked away from the agreement, although there's a transatlantic quarrel over this, the sanctions are clearly still hurting Iran. Iran, by its very steps of partially restarting the program and pushing the red lines of the guidelines, is indicating they would like to have the agreement back. They're saying, see what we could do without the agreement. They're putting pressure of their own to get the agreement back. I think if there's a will on both sides to get beyond the Soleimani assassination, we can get beyond it. If there's no will, that can be the pretext for either side of not moving forward.
Peter, I'll give you the final word before I let both of you go. The Israeli hand, hasn't it, been strengthened in some ways, Peter, recently with this normalization of ties with countries, Arab countries that in fact did not like the JCPOA as well, many of them, i.e. the Iran nuclear deal. Do you think in some ways that adds further pressure on the Biden administration? Because they will, I mean, they've already said that the Secretary of State nominee has already said, Blinken, that they would be engaging certainly with the Israelis, and I imagine even with those Arab countries, especially those who have normalized ties with Israel.
Yeah, I think the four powers that have joined through the Abraham Accords, these new partnerships or rapprochements, at least with Israel, are now kind of on Israel's side. And given that the U.S. has ties with and interests in all four of those states, that does make more difficult the U.S. task of bringing Israel along, because Israel has a few more friends in its corner, so to speak. But I don't think the prospect of a final understanding between the U.S. and Israel on this topic is all that far-fetched when one bears in mind that at the end of the day, both powers want a non-nuclear Iran, and their differences of opinion are mainly about tactics. Now, those differences are severe, Israel leaning toward the use of force to denuclearize Iran, the U.S. having relied on diplomacy. But both powers want that same goal. Both powers have a long legacy of shared interests and cooperative engagement. I think it's highly unlikely that there will be a major U.S.-Israel falling out over this topic. This is hard-headed diplomacy to try to advance the best interests of both states. That's where the appearance of conflict seems to occur.
All right, we'll leave it there at that, but we appreciate both Peter and David for putting this all into context for us and for sharing their expertise with us. The Israelis, as I said, warning the Americans. This may very well just be diplomatic talk, as both of our guests there spoke about, right? Pressuring the Americans not to go back to the JCPOA, because the Israelis didn't like it from day one anyhow, right? When the Obama administration had come and entered that agreement with the Iranians, along with, of course, other parties. That's very important to continually mention. This is not a bilateral agreement in any way, shape, or form. Nevertheless, it was the Americans who walked away from it. Will it be possible to even get back to the JCPOA in this context at this time for both the Iranians and the Americans? Both sides under a lot of pressure. Things have changed since the deal was signed. Then what happens next? Because the Americans want to go to the next step. The Israelis want to go to the next step. They want to talk about regional activities, ballistic missiles. The list is endless, right? Will the Iranians play ball in that sense? Because remember, there are also elections coming up in Iran very soon this year. And we are, for all intents and purposes, expecting a more conservative Iranian government. Will that sort of a government really be willing to compromise with the Americans, or even in some ways indirectly with the Israelis and other Arab countries also? A wait-and-see game, certainly. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Thank you for staying with us, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss Nancy Pelosi, who's the U.S. House of Representatives Speaker. She said that she will be proceeding with the Senate impeachment against Donald Trump, the trial, that is, the Senate trial. He's already been impeached, as we know, by the House of Representatives for a second time. At this point, we also know that there is a February date, I believe, that will be decided upon for that trial to then move ahead. She's insisting upon this trial, as well as all Democrats, because, according to her own words, and I'm quoting her now, she doesn't want to give Trump a get-out-of-jail-free card regarding the riot, especially the Capitol riot that had taken place before he left office. She's also rubbished any such sentiments that this will create further divisiveness in the country, though I imagine that can be argued both for and against at this point in time, because many Republicans are saying this may very well be a counterproductive exercise altogether. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. I'm joined by Dr. Clodagh Harrington, who is an associate professor of U.S. politics at the Department of Politics and Public Policy at De Montfort University. She's joining us today from Leicester in the UK. Joining us from Dahlonega, Georgia, is Dr. Carl Cavalli, who is a professor of political science at the University of North Georgia. Carl and Clodagh, thank you both for taking your time out to speak to us here in Scope. Clodagh, let me start with you. What do you make of a Senate trial this time? I mean, is this a good idea to go ahead with this? The argument for it, as Pelosi said, is that we don't want to give him a get-out-of-jail-free card, but at the same time, it will create further divisiveness, would it not?
It will. I think, I mean, I take Pelosi's words. I understand where she's coming from. I think it's all but impossible to give him a get-out-of-jail-free card, because what happened was so consequential and the stakes are so high. But having said that, I would say it is terrible, terrible timing, and I wish that the Biden administration, with its message of unity and its real desire to move forward, wasn't bound in this situation that it finds itself. But I think if there is blame, I would lay it really at the door of Donald Trump and some of his followers.
How does one go about doing this while also, as Biden said, bring the country together?
That's a very good question, actually. I think Dr. Harrington is correct in that the timing of this is probably about as bad as can be, the beginning of a new administration. Really, quite honestly, you said it perfectly at the very beginning. We are a divided nation, and ironically, we are divided about unity. There are Democrats who think that pursuing Trump, repudiation of Trump, will unify the nation. And some Republicans agree, but they're starting to back off of that now. Whereas a lot of Republicans still support Donald Trump, and they really feel that they're being attacked. I think their goal, their idea of promoting unity, that is among Republicans, would be to simply move on and forget about this.
So then, Clodagh, when we start with the trial itself, there was, this argument, as you well know, about giving Donald Trump proper time to be able to defend himself, to be able to gather lawyers, evidence, etc., all in place. And there was, a huge back and forth between Democrats and Republicans about that. I mean, it seems like there is being this fighting already from day one about this situation. That again doesn't bode well, right? About bipartisan partnership or cooperation within this administration. Is that fair to say?
Yes, it does. It's just terrible timing. It's just such a shame it couldn't, if it had to happen, that it just didn't come at quite this moment. I mean, there are some really big ticket items that the Senate needs to find some kind of unity on. And, despite the divisions and despite all the partisanship that we're all, so aware of, I mean, there are some things, and I'm thinking, pandemic management is obviously top of the list. The state of the economy, that matters to everybody. Other things, maybe kind of more practical nuts and bolts kind of things like, infrastructure, whatever. I think there are ways that you could possibly unite people in terms of here are some common goals that we all need to work towards. But then you have this elephant in the room, which is what this impeachment trial and Donald Trump still is, the fact that he is gone and yet he is still, very successfully managing to maintain, maybe not center stage, but still front page, I suppose. It's unfortunate.
So then, Carl, the huge context, of course, in the country right now, I was in the U.S. just a couple of days ago, is that, we have the COVID numbers going up higher and higher on a daily basis, right? Record-breaking, in fact. With this sort of thing happening as well, the trial, do you think that Republicans will not be as willing to work together with Democrats? Or do you think that both parties will move beyond Donald Trump at this time?
Well, I would have thought, if you had asked me a year ago, I would have thought that a worldwide pandemic that hits the United States as hard as any place else would be something that would unite even a country as divided as we are. But obviously that has not been the case. I will say that I think there may be an opening for President Biden ironically, given this division that we have. What it means is that while Republicans might be largely in opposition to anything that Biden does, and I would expect to see that, Democrats are also unified in favor. The most conservative Democrat, Joe Manchin of West Virginia, seems to be thoroughly in the Biden camp. And that may be an opening because Biden might be able to co-opt the one or two Republicans like Mitt Romney and Lisa Murkowski that are willing to cross party lines on a number of issues. And so Joe Biden doesn't need the large numbers that, for example, Barack Obama needed just a little over a decade ago. He had a huge Democratic majority in the Senate and could barely get anything done. Joe Biden, ironically, may not need those large numbers.
Especially when it comes to this what took place at the Capitol, right, Clodagh? Even Republicans came out quite strongly against that, saying that, and even some of them saying that Donald Trump did, in fact, in some ways incite that riot altogether. Do you think that they're also trying to clean their hands off of Donald Trump?
I think I'd be slow to make generalizations in the sense that I think there are, without doubt, many Republicans who would have been as horrified as the next person at what happened in the Capitol that day, because it was, it was horrendous by any measure. Then there are some who would have supported it. There are some who participated in it. There are others who think that it was a conspiracy of the left, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that there's a kind of a broad church of responses when you're talking about Republican response. And I think for me, one of the key themes, issues, challenges, whatever, in all of this is the issue of news and fake news and what people believe and what they choose to absorb as their own truth, because the facts should be the facts, but it isn't necessarily the case anymore that we all have the same facts. And so that means that the responses are going to be very scattered depending on the kind of person you are and the kind of news sources that you get.
Exactly. So on that point of facts and fake news, then, Carl, throughout Donald Trump's tenure, as we well know, of course, he was always battling quote unquote fake news, right? Now it's just a battle of perceptions as well, public perception of what's going on, right? I mean, regardless of whether or not Republicans and Democrats work together or not, it's all about the Republic. And whether we like it or not, Donald Trump does have a strong base still. I mean, I was in Texas and, just there in the lead up to the inauguration, there was all these fears about what may or may not happen there, especially in Austin. Do you think that will then continue to be a problem in the country, where the public may very well perceive things in a different way from what's actually really happening, be it the trial or otherwise?
Yeah, I think that's going to be, it predates Donald Trump. Donald Trump is not the creator of a divided reality or a divided perception among the public. We have been heading in this direction for a couple of decades now. I would say almost a quarter of a century, really. And so it's really deeply embedded to see our news reporting, our information reporting as divided as ever. And most people in the United States now create their own sort of little information cocoons, their own sort of information universes. And one side gets all of its information from Fox News. The other side gets all of its information from CNN or MSNBC. And those two outlets, for example, do present the world in very different, they paint very different pictures of the world. And so that's not going to go away anytime soon. There are Republicans who are turning away from Donald Trump. There are even some of the conspiracy theorists and the far-right extremists who have expressed disappointment with Trump and frustration with him. But that really represents a small segment. His approval rating among Republicans has dropped quite a bit, but it still means that 70% of all Republicans support Donald Trump.
Clodagh, I'll give you the final word before I let both of you go. Knowing Donald Trump, right, and the kind of showman that he is, I mean, he had that reality show before even coming into office, right, The Apprentice. Do you think that he's, in fact, going to make a huge show of this trial? And then that then very well means that Donald Trump will remain a household name for the foreseeable future?
Yes, well, he likes being in the headlines. I think we've all got a sense of that pretty spectacularly as time has gone on. I wonder if he does feel that it surpassed his wildest expectations or even desires maybe on the day of the siege of the Capitol. But certainly the Senate trial means he's going to be in the front pages. He's going to, he can play the victim. And I suppose another possible advantage from his perspective is if he presents as the disruptor in chief, which was kind of his star attraction back in 2016 on the campaign trail, he's now back on the outside being the renegade, sticking it to the system, that kind of thing again. And that's a role that he plays very well. So if he has got sympathetic media behind him, which I'm quite sure he will, even if he's sort of banned off the major social media sites, there's still plenty oxygen there by which he can ensure that people are still thinking and talking about him.
All right, we'll leave it there at that, but we appreciate Clodagh and Carl for taking their time out and for sharing their thoughts with us about what is to come, right? With the Senate trial of Donald Trump, it's set to begin in February, according to the reports that are coming out now. Democrats and Republicans seemingly compromising on the start date for that. But yes, Democrats insisting that there must be this trial, even though some Republicans are warning, is this really worth it? On the other hand, of course, as Pelosi has said, you can't just let him get away with it, right? If he is, in fact, guilty of inciting that riot altogether, then he should be held to account for said actions as well. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss ISIS claiming responsibility for that double suicide bombing in the Iraqi capital, downtown Baghdad, that killed around 32 people and has wounded, I believe, around 110 is the current number. That's the biggest suicide attack that city has seen in over or around 3 years, in fact. Now, the government had earlier said that there was a planned vote, of course, that was to take place in the country, and that has now been postponed. Was this attack in context of that, of course, considering it is ISIS, that may or may not be the context that needs to be discussed at this time. Nevertheless, there is now an announcement by security forces that there have been heightened operations against ISIS militants throughout the country in various parts, north, south, east, and west. But why exactly has this happened right now? As in, where did the intelligence go wrong? Where did security forces go wrong? In that this sort of humongous attack even took place in such a brazen fashion, that too, in downtown Baghdad, in that market. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. I'm joined by Dr. Afzal Ashraf, who is an assistant professor of international relations at the Center for Conflict, Security and Terrorism at the School of Politics and International Relations at the University of Nottingham. He's joining us today from London. Joining us today from Baghdad is Ahmed Rushdi, who is a senior foreign policy advisor for the Speaker's office at the Iraqi Parliament. Ahmed and Afzal, thank you both for taking your time out to join us here in Scope. Afzal, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of this attack after 3 years? Why now, in your opinion, and what's gone wrong vis-a-vis the intelligence and security forces?
Well, I think this attack, you've described it as possibly an intelligence failure, as something spectacular. That's exactly what people like ISIS would want. They want to remain relevant. They want to grab the headlines. The fact is, and I was out in Iraq in 2004 and 5, and so I know what the violence was like. And this is, in comparison to what Iraq has been through, albeit a very tragic and horrendous incident, as you described it, it is just something that, unfortunately, terrorist movements do. They want us to be talking about it. They want to remain relevant. And as far as what's gone wrong with the intelligence and security apparatus, well, I think that's something, of course, that the Iraqi government will look at. But even the best intelligence services and the best security forces do fall foul of terrorist attacks because they're designed to go beyond the capability and reach of the security services. Terrorists have the initiative. And what we've seen now is the fact that ISIS has become largely irrelevant in Syria. It has lost a lot of its territory. This was an organization 6 years ago that was claiming that it had established a state. It was 30 miles from Baghdad. It is now reverted to being a terrorist organization with few people spread around various villages and towns throughout Iraq and maybe some pockets of Syria. And the other thing that perhaps is not well known by a lot of people is that most of the followers of ISIS from across the world are incredibly disillusioned. And I can say this because I've spoken to ISIS prisoners, to Jabhat al-Nusra prisoners in Kyrgyzstan. I did some research there, which we just finished in the last month or so. And the vast majority of them are incredibly disillusioned. They found ISIS to be nothing like they'd imagined it to be. It was a very corrupt movement as far as they were concerned. So I think it's ISIS that is on the back foot and is struggling to remain relevant.
Ahmed, what are your thoughts about this? Because this will certainly have a political context within Iraq, right? The way people will view this, i.e., Iraqi citizens themselves.
I think what's happened before 2 days, it's something should be not happen. But because of Iraq has so many problems on a political, economical, social basis, and it is accumulative for 17 years. So you can imagine that ISIS will get benefit from all those things. In a way or another, before 1 year, we have massive demonstrations against corruption and against the political system in Iraq. So you can imagine a failure in the intelligence work. I think it's normal in the Iraqi issue. The most important thing is that, and I think our most important fear is that how can ISIS get advantage from those attacks? Because eventually, if you are not rehabilitating the liberated area, if you are in a mess in your economical situation, you have a major dispute on a political level, how you can imagine you can fight ISIS again? So you can imagine how much it was not only surprised, but also it makes Iraqis awake, is that we have so many problems that Daesh eventually get benefit from that. And not only that, we all know that there are sleeping cells, not only in Baghdad, in every liberated governorates. And you can imagine those sleeping cells, what are they are talking to Iraqis, is that they are saying, okay, this political system is totally corrupted, cannot be beneficial. It will end up with a mess for your life. So eventually, using those tools and end it with the suicide bombs, it shows you that how much they are doing a clever way to try to destroy the political system and try to eventually make Iraqis more desperate from this political system.
You know, Ahmed there hit on a very important point, didn't he? And that is, of course, stable governance is extremely important for security in any country, certainly around the world, but especially in a war-ridden country like Iraq. Is that fair to say?
I think that's a very good point. You're absolutely right. Ahmed makes a very good point about the ineffectiveness, the corruption, and other failings of the current Iraqi government. Well, indeed, all the Iraqi governments, to be honest, since the first elections took place in January of 2005, they've all been inefficient and ineffective and very partisan. And we've had in the last couple of years, 3 years, a number of major demonstrations, popular demonstrations against the inefficiencies and inabilities of the government. And as long as the government continues to fail to deliver its obligations, as long as the various parties in Iraq continue to fail to unite in the national cause, I'm afraid you are going to get a country that's vulnerable to these sort of problems, particularly to terrorism. Now, it is, whilst I totally agree, and I think this is the main point that Ahmed has made, let us not fall into the trap of giving credit to these people, because at the end of the day, if it wasn't the inefficiencies and the corruption that surrounds the current government, it would be another course, because these people are not there. They might claim to be championing the popular cause, but they're not. They have a particularly a parochial cause, and that is not an Iraqi cause. They want their own state. Well, they wanted it, they failed, and so they're now trying to provoke other problems. If Iraq fails, it gives them some form of legitimacy to try again. So I think whilst the problems are real, the answer that ISIS and other extremists are putting forward is not it's not an Iraqi answer. It won't deliver the sort of grievances that we've talked about.
That's also a good point, isn't it, Ahmed, where it is possible, my own understanding of this is that it's possible to overreact the other way, right? Where we can have, yes, disagreements, political disagreements, very important political disagreements within Iraqis themselves, but we should not allow or we should not give credence to any other, groups, especially the likes of ISIS, which, as Afzal there said, want to establish their own state.
Yes, it's true, but this cannot happen if everything stopped. Corruption stops, political conflict stopped on that way. But you can imagine when you have early election in June, the government actually declare that there is early elections in June, the 6th of June, then the Iraqis surprised that it is postponed until October, the 10th of October. So you can imagine how much they become more desperate from this political system. My main fear, it's more depending on the social problem. It's not political problem, because as a normal Iraqis, I will say eventually, okay, guys, they are corrupted and Daesh is criminals. Let them both fight. It's not my matter. This is what our real fear. But because it's happened in Anbar, is that they fought Al-Qaeda, then they saw a corrupted local government. So they said, okay, it's Qaeda and local government. It's not our business anymore, the people of Anbar. And then Daesh came. So you can imagine maybe the same scenario will be again, because eventually, if I'm going to say I'm going to fight Daesh, but for what? Because I have corrupted political system, so why I'm doing that? So you can imagine how much it's now become a very desperate society, desperate Iraqi society. In a way, every single problem, even normal problems, it's all on the head of the political blocs. So, and let us not forget, we have an economical crisis because even until now, we don't have a budget that it's supposed to be voted by the parliament, and there are cuts on salaries, and there is a raising up for the dollar's price. So you can imagine how much the economic situation will be bad in 2021. Now, you postpone the early elections, you are actually making my economical life so bad, and you want me to fight Daesh. This is not going to happen. Eventually, the government, the political blocs should be united, should be try to rehabilitate the political system, or else.
I wonder, Afzal, then, what role should the international community be playing then in this regard, right? Because it seems that the coalition, the U.S. coalition, has been involved for a significant amount of time now, of course, in a much smaller role now, but at the same time, then we also know that there's this, what's at least termed the proxy war between the Iranians and the Americans also on Iraqi soil. I mean, all of that hodgepodge of different external actors, I would think, is not helping the situation.
Well, it isn't helping, you're right, but it could help. It very much depends on how the external actors behave, what their priorities are, and how the Iraqi government deals with them. You see, the international community as a whole has much to help. There's a lot that the international community can do in terms of equipping the Iraqi government for better governance, particularly for better security, even little things like how to get information out of former terrorists or captured terrorists. That's a specialist technique that has proven to be successful without torture. Torture does not help. There are so many advanced areas of assistance that can be provided, but it very much depends on what the Iraqi government and the Iraqi people want. They're getting help from Iran, and that may be a good thing. But Iran comes with its own priorities, just like any other country. And what states' priorities are always, if you like, they're always insular. They want something for themselves. They look at the world through the lens of security rather than through the lens of economic and social and political development. The issues that Ahmed is explaining are very valid. And there have been a problem in Iraq as part of the political debate in Iraq, the demonstrations that have continued, and I can understand his frustration at not having the elections in June and maybe having them deferred till October. The point, of course, is those elections won't necessarily deliver a solution. They'll deliver a change maybe, but they won't necessarily deliver a solution to the problem that Iraq has had. And that problem is what I've described in an article I've written as a collective equivalent of a post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Iraq went through a decade of probably one of the most brutal sanction regimes ever known in history. And then it had this invasion by the US-led forces, and it has never been allowed time to recover. And it is up to the leadership in Iraq, and there are some very good leaders in Iraq, wise leaders, to allow the country time for social and political healing so that it can move forward.
Yeah, and that's a very good point. I do apologize for cutting you off. Unfortunately, the clock has gotten the best of us, but that was a really good point to end off on about the fact that, yes, we do not appreciate sometimes how, how new essentially this new governing system in Iraq is in comparison, of course, and in context to other countries who have had a huge head start in, stabilizing their respective governing systems. I'd like to appreciate both Afzal and Ahmed for their time today. Afzal are speaking to us from London, as well as Ahmed, who is speaking to us from the Iraqi capital, Baghdad, both of them sharing their expertise with us on this extremely important topic. Iraq still very much in the throes, seemingly, of insecurity. Is this a sign that the intelligence and security forces are not getting it right? I mean, at the same time, this is the first such attack after 3 years. So that's also something that's one should be, to an extent, of course, proud of. Of course, it's never a good thing when innocents are killed in this horrendous fashion as well. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.